Hello YouTube, Sidekick here in my trusty F-14 Tomcat. And now, this is a first for me. It's the first time I've made a video in the F-14. It's also the first time I've made a video in a plane that was donated to the channel. The F-14 effectively showed up in my inbox a few weeks back in a note from Eagle Dynamics letting me know that it had been gifted to me by effectively an anonymous donor. I was, frankly, stunned by this act of massive generosity. Now, I had not flown and did not own the F-14 because of its well-deserved reputation for having been designed solely as an air-to-air aircraft focused on air superiority and long-range interception. I assumed that its air-to-ground capability was an afterthought, which, truthfully, it is. I kind of assumed that it would not be all that interesting as an iron bomber. Well, I was wrong about that. Oh boy, was I wrong about that. To everyone out there who's been telling me I should try the Bombcat, I happily and freely admit that you were right. But all of this does point to the fact that the bombing capability in the F-14 is kind of interesting for reasons not of technology or aircraft design, but in some ways because of its history. Which, of course, means that we're going to have to talk about it, because as my regular viewers know, I love, as much as I love dropping bombs in DCS, I love talking about the history of dropping bombs and the planes that drop them even more. So you can see I'm in the F-14. I'm actually swapping back and forth between the back seat and the front seat, getting myself set up for an air-to-ground run. I won't go into how to configure all that. The F-14's been around long enough. There are enough videos out there about how to do it, either yourself in the back seat or with the aid of Jester. So before we go out and drop some bombs in the Cat, we need to talk a bit about why we would want to do that in an aircraft that was designed to be the most advanced air-to-air fighter of its day. I'll try not to go into too much detail, but it really is an interesting story. It's a story that is probably not known, or at least not fully appreciated to an awful lot of people who know, or at least have heard of, the F-14. In fact, thanks to Hollywood, the F-14 may be one of the best known but most misunderstood planes in DCS. I don't mean underappreciated or underestimated, but misunderstood for sure. I know I certainly did not understand it until I flew it in DCS. So let's start with a quick history lesson. The first thing to understand about the F-14 is where it came from and what it was meant or designed to do. Design, or rather requirements definition, which is what precedes design in the world of military procurement, really began in the mid-1960s. The design that eventually became the F-14 was intended to replace the F-4 that was actually only just then coming into service. As a replacement, it was needed to respond to a new threat that the F-4 was not really well suited to countering, and also it needed to correct or improve some aspects of the F-4 design. Now, the new threat that it needed to address was the rise of Soviet naval aviation, which was not carrier aircraft, but rather long-range bombers and missiles designed to destroy aircraft carriers. The range of the bombers meant that ships could be attacked in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and the range of the missiles meant that those bombers needed to be intercepted at ranges in excess of 100 nautical miles from the carrier. To accomplish this required a new aircraft and a new air-to-air missile. The Navy also wanted this new design to address some of the least desirable features of the F-4, primarily its low-speed performance, which made it both a challenge to dogfight in and a challenge, frankly, to land on a carrier deck. Now, after a whole lot of programmatic and political twists and turns that I won't go into, the result was the F-14. It was, in effect, an aircraft designed around its radar, actually, because the real key to solving the long-range interception problem was the radar. Now, radar in the F-4 was very advanced for its day, but it was not as good as it needed to be, because, of course, the key to guiding a semi-active radar-guided missile, which is what was available in the 1960s, was not the missile. It was the radar in the aircraft that launched it. The poor performance of the AIM-7 Sparrow in Vietnam is often attributed to problems with the missile, which is partly true, but a big part of the problem was actually the F-4's radar. It was not easy to operate, it could not scan for targets while it tracked one, it could only track one at a time, and it really could not track targets below the aircraft because it would lose them in the ground cover. An actual much better solution was needed for this new fleet interceptor. Now, this turned out to be the AWG-9 radar, which was a huge improvement. It had a much longer range than any other airborne radar at the time. It could track multiple targets, it could track while it scanned, it used Doppler pulse technology that could separate a moving target from the ground or water behind it. It was developed in the mid-1960s, and it truly was a marvel of modern technology for the time. But it was also very large, very heavy, and it required a lot of power to run it. This meant that the F-14 was going to have to be a large aircraft. It would need large engines. It, in fact, would need to be the largest aircraft that had ever flown off or onto an aircraft carrier. It was also going to have to be ridiculously fast and climb like a rocket ship in order to reach the bombers before they could launch their loads of death and destruction. Now, matching those requirements with the desire to have a plane that could at least be competitive in a turning fight and that was able to land and take off from a moving carrier deck required some serious outside-the-box thinking. Designers at Grumman turned to two innovations that were just then being experimented with. The first was the variable geometry or swing wing, and the second was the lifting body design. Both innovations are worth going into, but I'll probably do that in my History of Iron Bombing podcast at a later date rather than here. For now, let's just say that the combination of these two features gave the F-14 a much expanded flight envelope. It could fly faster and higher than the F-4, but it could also turn better at low speeds, and it was much easier to handle on takeoff, approach, and landing. But these features, combined with the new radar and the new long-range Phoenix missile, meant that it was a whole lot more complex than anything that had flown before, particularly anything that had ever flown off an aircraft carrier. It was also ridiculously expensive, not only to buy, but to operate as well. And it was this fact that eventually came back to haunt the F-14. As time progressed into the 70s and 80s, radar technology improved, which mainly meant that radars got smaller and lighter and less power-hungry, while still matching, or coming close to matching, the performance of the AWG-9. New innovations in aerodynamics, like wing leading edge extensions and augmented stability and fly-by-wire systems, ended up providing ways of expanding the flight envelope that were less complex, easier to implement, and basically cheaper to maintain than the variable geometry wings in the F-14. Okay, it looks like we're just about ready here in the aircraft to get out to the range, so I'm going to start taxiing out. We are, of course, at Kobuleti, going out to the Caucasus Iron Bombing test range, and I'll just continue talking about the end of life of the F-14 here as we go out to give it a try. First the Hornet and then the Super Hornet ended up providing performance that matched or exceeded the Tomcat. Well, except in some very specific corners of the flight envelope, where the Tomcat was still superior. But they were much cheaper to buy and much easier and cheaper to maintain, particularly at sea. And then the AIM-120 arrived, which was kind of the great equalizer, because just about any fighter could carry that missile, and it had a range that was almost equivalent to the Phoenix, which could only be carried by the F-14. And again, the AMRAAM did not match the Phoenix's speed or hitting power, but it was a much more reliable missile, and it did not require as much from the firing aircraft and its radar. So again, it was a cheaper and much more functional solution. So by the early 1990s, the writing was kind of on the wall for the F-14. As an interceptor and air superiority fighter, it did still have a few advantages, but those really were outweighed by the evolving requirements and its costs compared to the alternative. In a more or less desperate attempt to keep the Tomcat relevant, Grumman set about expanding its capabilities by adding the ability to engage targets on the ground. At first, this consisted of simply adding the ability to drop iron bombs. Yes, the Tomcat was an iron bomber first. Believe it or not, though, this capability was not actually added until 1992. Just in time for the first Gulf War, and it resulted in the new version of the Tomcat being christened the Bombcat. The Navy rejected proposals for more complex and complete overhauls of the F-14 to make it a truly multi-role fighter, but the addition of a lantern targeting pod was relatively low cost as a solution, and that allowed the F-14 to employ laser-guided bombs, which greatly expanded its utility and allowed it to hang around for about a dozen more years. Eventually, though, when the Super Hornets, including the F-18 F-2-seater models, were available throughout the fleet, the F-14 was finally retired from service. That was in 2006, 32 years to the day after it had entered service. Okay, and we are rolling. Hope you enjoyed that history lesson. It's not stuff you really need to know how to drop bombs in the F-14, but at least for me, it was stuff I needed to know to understand why it works the way it does. And we'll talk about a little bit about that as we go out to the range. So that is what we're going to do on this flight. We're just going to go out and do a sort of standard range run that you'll probably be familiar with if you spend any time on my channel. We're taking off from Kobuleti, going to go out to the test range that is instrumented with the target impact tracking script so we can track how well our iron bombing drops go. And when we're doing that, we'll just talk a little bit about how the F-14 works. I won't spend a lot of time sort of on the switchology of how to set it up. As I said, there's lots of videos on that if that's what you want to know, but maybe this video will help you appreciate exactly why it works the way it does, because there are some pretty interesting things about it. The F-14, you got to remember that the avionics in the F-14 were designed in the late 60s, early 70s. By the time it became an iron bomber in 1992, HUD symbology and a lot of other things like that had really moved on. And you compare it to the F-18 or the Harrier, and you take a look at the HUD that it uses, it's quite a bit less sophisticated because the avionics it was built around just couldn't put the number of symbols on the screen that those later jets could. So it's really kind of interesting to be dropping bombs in 1992 using a HUD that was designed in like 1970. But it is a HUD. It does have what amounts to a CCIP pipper, although the Tomcat doesn't call it that. It calls it computer pilot mode, as opposed to computer target mode, which is essentially CCRP, which we'll talk about in another video because it's a little bit interesting as well. But this basically works like CCIP. You go into computer pilot mode. As soon as you switch to air-to-ground mode, you get the display that you see on screen now. That's a bomb fall line coming down straight from the middle of the screen. Unlike some other symbology, it doesn't just start at the flight path vector, but you have a flight path vector, you have a bomb fall line, and the bomb fall line will end in a pipper, and that is all you need to drop iron bombs accurately, as you will see when we start actually doing that. It's actually, in some ways, it's actually a very effective system because it is simple. There's very little else on your HUD. You got no airspeed, you don't have any real altitude cues, you get a heading cue, and you get the big ORD across the middle of it saying, hey, you're dropping bombs. So it's a very simple HUD because the avionics of the day just couldn't display. It wasn't a computer screen like they are today. It was literally a display. As you will see, though, the computer works remarkably well. It's very accurate. It uses the AWG-9 as an air-to-ground radar. When you put the system in air-to-ground mode, it aims the radar at the ground and then uses that to calculate your slant range. And obviously it's a good radar, which is probably partly why it gets such good results. So the system is really no different than it would be in any other iron bomber. The one thing that you have to realize is that Rio has all of, so Jester has all of the switches that control which pylons you're going to drop from, whether you're going to ripple, whether you're going to use singles, what the delay between the ripples are going to be. All that stuff is controlled in the rear cockpit. You have no indications whatsoever in the front cockpit of how those switches are set, by the way. You can get it by looking at the Jester menu, but you can't get it by looking at anything in the front cockpit. So there is that's a little bit interesting. The other thing is that the Rio sets the type of ordnance. Unlike a modern jet, that is not detected by the aircraft. If you set that wrong, you will not hit the target, as I can attest to, because I ended up setting up high drag bombs when I meant to be dropping low drag bombs, and I kept missing the target by a long amount, and I didn't understand why, and it was because the computer was calculating as if they were high drag bombs and I was dropping low drag ones, so they just kept going along. So you do have to make sure all of that is right, either by using the Jester menu or by hopping in the back seat and checking the switches. So you want to make sure you do that, because there's nothing in the front cockpit that's going to tell you if any of those things are not set up the way you want them to be. That's one difference. So we're just starting our first run here. As you can see, absolutely classic standard run. We're going to be using a fairly shallow dive angle, I think, from this perspective, but a nice easy roll in. Looks easy from inside anyways. Now, the one thing that I noticed with the F-14 is it is a big aircraft. It has lots of momentum. It's like the F-15 and to some extent the F-18. When you pull the nose around onto the target, you do have to stop pulling and even use a little bit of forward pressure to get the flight path vector on the target before you roll out. Whenever I was having sort of inaccurate drops, it mostly came back to that. Here we are, and pickle. Get a nice, very satisfying bomb drop sound. We dropped all 4 at the same time. Why not? Let's make our point, eh? And that looks like a good drop. We'll wait and see what target impact tracking script has to say. So as I said, it does repay a little bit of extra going out and flying and actually trying to drop bombs, getting to know the right touch so that you're actually stopping the roll in and starting the roll out at exactly the right place. So those are pretty decent results for a first time around the range. We'll probably do a little bit better than that. So yeah, that's really the only thing I found dropping bombs in the F-14 really straightforward once I learned the F-14 systems, which are, again, a bit different than any other aircraft, so you need to spend a time getting familiar with the cockpit. But in terms of familiar with the way to drop bombs, it's really about as simple as it gets. It's very straightforward. And as you'll see, it's pretty easy to be pretty darn accurate with this thing, which again kind of surprised me. I hadn't been expecting that. So my hat is off to all those people who said I really should try it. You were right. It's a lot of fun to drop iron bombs in, and it really is interesting. It's a modern iron bomber because it became an iron bomber in 1992 using systems invented in 1970, which is a really funny kind of juxtaposition that I find interesting. So here we go, another roll in, a little bit steeper dive this time. That should allow us to be a little bit more accurate. Once again, it's a question of stopping the roll out or the roll in so we can start the roll out, getting the bomb fall line coming up to the target, through the target, and then timing the pickle. The symbology can be a little bit hard to read sometimes. Seeing the pipper cross in the middle of the screen, it gets confused with the datum line mark sometimes, and even the attitude marks. That's one thing you do have to spend some time looking at it to make sure you can read the cue properly. That looked like a pretty good drop. Let's see what target impact tracking script has to say about that one. Okay, that's pretty nice. It's going to be, pretty hard to beat that, I think. Or maybe the more appropriate way to say it is if I can turn in numbers like that consistently, I think I'd be happy. If there's even one thing I want to work on, it's maybe trying to find a way to drop a little higher. 3,500 feet, not all that high, especially not in 1992 with Manpad's missiles around, especially with the kind of heat signature that the Tomcat puts out. So we probably really want to be dropping higher than that if we can be. But again, that's usually just a question of refining the technique. Getting that rollout properly is really one of the keys to making sure you can drop early enough to drop high enough. So it's really just a matter of practice. Maybe we'll see if we can improve that a little on this run here. Once again, this one's kind of in the middle between the last two. It's not terribly steep, but we did start a little higher than we did the last time. Let's see if we can also drop a little higher. So you see the flight path vector continuing to move even though I'm not moving the nose because the aircraft is behind the inputs. I'm trying to aim a little bit farther beyond the target. Got to keep the bomb fall line through the middle of the target though. Watch the cross, and pickle. So this time we're going for the white building. See how we did on that one. The white building has the advantage of actually being able, you can see it from farther away, so it's a little bit easier. Well, we nailed it. Let's see what kind of altitude we got on the drop. I use that white building especially if I'm trying to do long run-ins because some of the other targets, even with the new spotting system DCS, a little hard to see from far back and from high up. Well, it's pretty hard to argue with those results. I think I'm going to quit while I'm ahead, folks. There's still lots more to talk about in terms of iron bombing with the Bombcat, but I don't really want to go into anything technical today. That's a video's probably long enough as it is.
You know what, though? There's probably one more thing that we have to do since this is a Bombcat video. I think we're going to have to go buzz the tower. So hang on there for a minute while we go back to Coboletti and let everybody know what a great day we had. Alright, we're getting lined up on Coboletti. Let me just say one more time how much I very much appreciate whoever it was that gifted me the Bombcat. It has definitely been an education and one that I've really enjoyed. I think it's going to be a great addition to the channel. I hope you guys have enjoyed it as well. So enjoy the buzzing of the tower. Hold on to those coffee cups. And this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.